Imagine standing at the grave of the man you loved for nearly 3 decades, only to discover he had another family all along. The whispers at the funeral weren't words of sympathy, they were daggers, branding me a mistress in front of strangers who turned out not to be strangers at all. His other wife, his grown children, his secret life that erased mine in a single moment. What if everything you thought was love was only half the truth? What if the man who held your hand every night was holding someone else's in another state? This is not fiction. This is not a nightmare. This is my story. And before you judge me, listen, because the lies he left behind nearly destroyed me, but they also exposed the darkest corners of betrayal. Stay with me. Subscribe to Silent Lies, and let me show you how one funeral became the day my entire world collapsed. The morning of the funeral felt like the air itself was pressing down on me, as if the sky had decided to share in my grief. It was not just gray, it was heavy. The kind of gray that seeps into your chest and settles there, daring you to breathe. I had woken up too early, restless, staring at the ceiling with the kind of dread you cannot explain until you have lived it. I dressed carefully, pulling on black clothes that were meant to honor the man I had loved for 27 years. I chose a dress that was plain, conservative, the kind of thing that would make me look like what I believed myself to be. A widow. That was my title now. His wife left behind. When I stepped into the church, I carried myself with the quiet dignity I thought the moment required. For almost 3 decades I had lived with William as his partner. We never had children. I could not. And though it was a wound I carried in silence, he never made it feel like a failing. He told me I was enough. He told me that love could be whole even without children. I believed him. I believed every word. And yet as I walked past the rows of pews, I began to notice the eyes. They were not filled with pity or compassion. They were sharp, cold, and unfamiliar. People stared at me as if I were an intruder. At first I thought perhaps they were colleagues, friends from his endless trips for work, strangers to me but loyal to him. He was gone so often, 6 months at a time, traveling for what he claimed was consulting. He hated technology, avoided phones, said he was old-fashioned. I let myself believe it, but the truth was already there, waiting to pounce. I spotted her at the front before I understood who she was. A woman close to my age, wearing black that looked less like mourning and more like armor. She stood stiff, her shoulders squared, her grief etched not in despair but in fury. And beside her, 2 adults children. One man, his jaw tight, his fists clenched, and a young woman who kept her gaze locked on me like I had done something unspeakable. The unease grew into dread. I told myself stories in my head. Maybe they were cousins, maybe distant relatives. But deep down, something sharp and cold was beginning to rise in my chest. The service blurred around me. Hymns, words of scripture, a priest speaking about eternal rest. But I was not listening. I was watching them. Their eyes did not leave me, and I felt smaller by the second. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, the paranoia of grief, until the moment the ceremony ended. I walked toward the exit, my heart beating so loudly I could hear it over the organ, and then it happened. A voice cut through the silence like a blade. Unbelievable. She has the nerve to show her face here. The words froze me in place. I turned, and there he was, the man in his 30s, his face red with anger, pointing directly at me. The sound echoed in the church, bouncing off the stone walls. Every head turned toward us. His mother, the other woman in black, reached for his arm, trying to pull him back, but the words kept spilling out like venom. You ruined our family. You were nothing but a mistress. And now you want pity? Mistress. The word struck harder than any slap could have. A ripple moved through the crowd. Murmurs, scoffs, laughter, all of it directed at me. I tried to breathe, but my chest locked up. My knees trembled, and I looked at the woman. Her eyes did not hold confusion. They held knowledge. She knew me. She knew who I was, and somehow I had no idea who she was. The betrayal was so sharp I could not speak. I wanted to scream that I did not understand, that I was not what they said I was, but my mouth refused to open. My legs carried me out of the church before my brain caught up, stumbling into the cold air outside, my pulse so loud it drowned out the world. That evening I sat on the floor of my living room, shoes still on, lights off, staring into nothing. I did not cry. I was too stunned for tears. The house felt foreign, each familiar object warped by the knowledge that my life had been built on a lie. The truth was beginning to bleed through the silence. William had another wife, another family. children grown into adults, 27 years of what I thought was marriage, reduced to the role of the other woman, and I had never known. The humiliation was suffocating. My heart was broken, but not by his death, by the revelation that I had been living inside a performance, applauding the love story I thought was ours while he was writing another play elsewhere. I walked through the rooms like a ghost, touching the jacket he had left by the door, inhaling the faint trace of his cologne. I hated that I could still love the scent, even as it mocked me with its lies. Every memory replayed in my mind. The anniversaries, the quiet dinners, the vacations, each one cracked open, revealing a darker truth behind it. He had smiled at me in Connecticut while preparing to kiss her in New Jersey. He had whispered, "You are enough," while dividing his time between two lives. And the cruelest part, I had loved him with everything I had, love that now felt like it had been carved into my bones, leaving scars that would not fade. Later that night, I received a message from someone I once thought was a friend. Just a single sentence. "Saw what happened at the funeral. I cannot believe you did that to his real family. Do not contact me again." Real family. The words sliced deeper than any accusation. I checked my phone again and again, hoping it was a mistake. But it was only the beginning. Online posts started appearing, painting me as the villain, the mistress who showed up in black. She lived off his money while he was dying. Hate filled my inbox from strangers and acquaintances alike. No one asked for my side. No one wanted the truth. The verdict had already been written. I was guilty of loving a man who lied to both of us. I sat in that suffocating silence, my heart numb, my mind spinning. Was I blind? Were the signs always there, the phone calls he took outside, the suitcase he packed himself, the months away on business trips? Did I choose to believe his stories because the comfort of love was easier than the risk of doubt? I did not know, but one thing was clear. The woman I had been, the trusting wife who built her world around him, had been buried right alongside William. What was left was someone raw, broken, and about to face the firestorm of a truth I never asked for. The night after the funeral stretched endlessly, every hour heavier than the last. I did not sleep. Instead, I sat curled on the floor, the glow of my phone lighting up my hollow face. Notifications poured in like a flood. Posts on social media, messages in my inbox, comments from people who once shared dinners in my home or greeted me in grocery store aisles. None of them asked for my side. None of them wanted to understand. They had already chosen the story they liked best. That I was the hidden mistress, the opportunist who paraded into a funeral dressed in black, pretending to be a grieving wife. Each cruel sentence pierced deeper. She waited for him to die so she could cash in. She stole his life, his money, and his dignity. Words have weight, and these words felt like stones hurled through the fragile glass of my soul. By morning, I felt hollowed out, like I had been scraped clean from the inside. I boiled water, made tea, but the taste was ash in my mouth. I watched the steam curl upward and vanish, wishing I could do the same. But reality held me tight. The walls of my home, once a sanctuary, now mocked me with their silence. I wandered from room to room, touching objects that had once been filled with comfort. A wedding photo, his jacket on the chair, the faint indentation on his pillow. Every detail seemed to sneer. You were never his only one. The life you cherished was built on sand, and the tide has come in. At some point, I could not take the not knowing anymore. My mind was a cruel carousel, spinning with questions I could not answer. So I turned to the only thing that could not lie: paper. I pulled out the files, the bank statements, the credit card bills. My hands shook as I spread them across the table. I traced the dates with my finger. Flights scheduled twice a year, always the same months, never deviating. Wire transfers, regular and generous, sent to accounts I had never seen before. A health insurance policy under a name I did not recognize. Rent for a home I had never stepped into. Each page was another nail hammered into the coffin of the life I thought I had. He had been meticulous, building his double existence with such precision that it might have continued forever had death not intervened. As I pieced together the truth, I felt less like a wife and more like an investigator of my own life. Each discovery sliced through me, leaving me gasping. How could I have been so blind? I replayed our past with new eyes, searching for signs. The late-night phone calls he always stepped outside to take. The suitcase he never let me pack. The birthdays that always fell during his business trips. How had I accepted it all without question? Was I naive, desperate, or simply in love? Perhaps all three. The weight of it was unbearable. I was not only grieving a man, I was grieving myself, the woman who had believed so completely. Outside my walls, the world sharpened against me. At the grocery store, I felt eyes linger too long. Whispers seemed to bloom behind me like shadows I could not escape. I walked quickly, head down, clutching my basket as though it were armor. Every sound felt like a judgment. Every glance felt like accusation. Soon I began locking my doors twice, sometimes 3 times, checking the windows before bed. My heart leapt at every knock, every unexpected sound. I had become a prisoner inside my own skin. The torment did not stop at gossip and whispers. Photos from the funeral surfaced online. My face blurred, but not enough. People recognized me. They called me the shameless intruder, the fraud who dared mourn a man who belonged to someone else. A local forum ran threads dedicated to dissecting my life, painting me as a thief. Some even claimed I had plotted this, that I had known all along, that I had manipulated him into leaving me something in his will. Lies stacked upon lies, and I had no voice loud enough to counter them. One message in particular haunted me. It came from someone I had once called a friend. "Do not contact me again. I cannot believe you would do that to his real family." Real family. That phrase echoed endlessly in my mind. A cruel reminder that in the eyes of the world, I was counterfeit. A shadow cast over another woman's rightful place. I pressed my hands to my ears sometimes as if I could silence the words by force. But they always found a way back in. I began to question everything. Had I been so desperate for love that I ignored what was obvious? Had I lived in willful ignorance because the truth would have destroyed me sooner? Perhaps I had. Or perhaps William was simply that skilled at deception, a man who could build 2 lives so seamlessly that neither one ever bled into the other. The thought made me sick. It also made me furious. Furious at him for lying, furious at myself for believing, furious at the world for condemning me without trial. But fury does not sustain you. Fury burns bright, then leaves only ashes. After days of pacing, staring at walls that no longer felt like mine, I sank into numbness. A kind of stillness that is not peace but paralysis. I moved through the house like a stranger, touched by nothing, hollowed out. I drank tea I could not taste. I showered without feeling the water. I slept in fits, waking with my heart pounding from dreams that dissolved into confusion. The silence was suffocating, but so was every attempt to escape it. In quieter moments, I wondered if this was punishment. Punishment for wanting too much, for loving too completely, for building my identity around a man who was not who he claimed to be. I wondered if the universe was mocking me, teaching me a lesson I had not asked to learn. But most of all, I wondered if I would ever feel whole again, or if I was destined to remain a fractured woman defined by betrayal. Every night, as I lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling, I felt the weight of his absence. Not just because he was gone, but because the man I loved had never truly existed in the way I believed. The Margaret who had smiled, who had cooked dinners and planned vacations and written love notes for his return, she was gone, buried alongside him. The woman left behind was someone new, someone raw, someone who would soon have to face the next devastating revelation. The reading of the will. The day of the will reading arrived like a storm I had been dreading but could not outrun. I spent hours pacing my house, holding my keys in one hand, my coat draped over a chair, unable to decide whether to go. A voice inside me whispered, "What is the point?" Nothing he left behind could erase the betrayal. But another part of me, desperate and wounded, insisted I needed to know. I needed to hear if he had thought of me at all in those final choices, if somewhere among the ruins of his double life there was at least a trace of acknowledgement. The lawyer's office was downtown, in a brick building that smelled of dust, old paper, and the faint sharpness of disinfectant. The waiting room hummed with tension. I arrived last, slipping inside quietly, but all eyes turned anyway. Helena was already there, her arms folded tight across her chest like she was bracing herself against a blow. Her children flanked her like soldiers, their hostility radiating in every glance. I sat alone in the back corner, clutching my purse so tightly my knuckles ached. I felt like a criminal awaiting sentencing rather than a widow attending to her husband's estate. The lawyer, an older man in a tan suit, cleared his throat and began. His tone was flat, professional, as if reading a grocery list. William's estate, he said, was substantial. Multiple properties, investments, accounts, retirement funds. I had known we were comfortable, but I had never seen the scope of it. William had always spoken of saving for later, for a future that now seemed like a cruel illusion. As the lawyer listed the assets, I held my breath, waiting for the blow. The first property, a house in New Jersey, was left to Helena. I heard her daughter exhale sharply, relief mixed with something bitter. Then came trusts for the children, carefully outlined, numbers attached. That part I expected. They were his children. They carried his blood. But then the lawyer's voice shifted, and I felt the air in the room tighten. The remainder of the estate, he read, is to be inherited by Margaret Turner. My name spoken into the tense silence, attached to words like retirement accounts, investment portfolios, the marital home, personal savings, all of it. Mine. For a heartbeat, the room was still. Then came the eruption. A chair scraped violently against the tile. Helena's son shot to his feet, his face flushed crimson, his finger stabbing the air toward me like an accusation. She knew. She had to have known. You do not give someone everything unless they are in on it. His voice was thunder, shaking the walls. His sister joined in, her words sharper, spitting venom. He was our father. You were just his distraction. You think you can walk out of here with everything? Over our dead bodies. I wanted to speak, to explain that I had not known, that I had not asked for any of this. But my voice betrayed me. My throat felt like sandpaper. My chest crushed beneath the weight of so many eyes. Helena's gaze cut through me from across the room. She was not shouting, not weeping. She just looked hollow, emptied out, and in her emptiness I saw myself. We were both women deceived, yet in this cruel theater, I was cast as the thief, and she as the wronged wife. I whispered, almost too quietly for anyone to hear. I did not know. But the words hung in the air like fragile glass, and no one believed me. The hostility was suffocating. The lawyer tried to calm the room, but chaos had already been unleashed. Every eye in that office bore into me with suspicion, anger, contempt. I stood, my legs trembling, and walked out before I could collapse under the weight of it all. Outside, the world felt colder than it had in years. I moved through the streets like a shadow, my name echoing in my ears. Later that night, the whispers became headlines. The local paper ran a story. Secret wife inherits fortune after businessman's death. They did not use my name, but they did not need to. The details were enough for everyone in town to know exactly who the article was about. My phone buzzed relentlessly with messages, some from people demanding explanations, others spitting accusations. Online, strangers dissected my life as if it were theirs to own. I was branded the fortune hunter, the schemer who had stolen what was not hers. But what no one seemed to understand was that none of it felt like wealth to me. When I sat alone at my kitchen table, surrounded by folders of financial documents, the numbers looked monstrous, meaningless. Millions, they said. Millions that should have made me feel secure. But instead, every dollar was soaked in deceit. The money felt like a curse, like ashes that stained my hands no matter how tightly I tried to wash them clean. I hired a lawyer of my own, not to fight, but to make sure I had not accidentally stepped into something illegal. I feared that simply being in his will would mark me as a fraud. But every document checked out. William had made the changes a year before his death, in full control of his mind, with all the necessary witnesses. It was airtight. It was his choice. And yet that was what haunted me most. Why had he done it? Why leave everything to me, knowing it would ignite war, knowing it would leave me hunted and despised? Was it guilt? Was it his way of apologizing? Or was it just one final manipulation, a way to bind me to him even after death? The questions circled endlessly, offering no peace. Outside, the attacks intensified. Helena's son sent furious emails, each more unhinged than the last. He called me a parasite, accused me of poisoning William's mind, even hinted I had driven him to an early grave. Helena's daughter turned her grief into spectacle, posting about me on social media, fueling strangers' rage. My name became synonymous with betrayal, with theft, with shame. Some nights, I stood by the window staring out at the dark streets, wondering if the whispers outside were real or just in my head. I started jumping at shadows, convinced that at any moment someone would confront me, spit in my face, or worse. The inheritance did not feel like safety. It felt like a target painted on my back. But what hurt most was not the money, not the accusations, not even the public humiliation. What hurt most was that I could not ask him why. The man who had shared my life for 27 years had left me drowning in questions without answers. His silence now was louder than any confession could have been, and in that silence I began to realize that the life I thought I had been living was over. What remained was a new identity I never asked for. The villain in someone else's story. The stranger who walked out of a lawyer's office carrying not just an inheritance, but the unbearable weight of betrayal. I had not planned to see her again. After the chaos of the will reading, I told myself that distance was the only shield I had left. Yet the silence inside my house was unbearable. Every time I tried to sleep, I woke with the sound of voices accusing me. Helena's son shouting, her daughter spitting venom, strangers calling me a thief. Even the walls seemed to whisper. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, the noise would fade, but it only grew louder inside my chest. Eventually, desperation drowned out fear. I decided to reach out, not out of courage, but because I needed to face the only other person who knew what it felt like to be destroyed by William's lies. I chose a neutral place, a small cafe in a neighboring town where no one knew me. I wrote Helena a message that was polite, careful, almost timid. I told her I did not want a fight, only a conversation. I expected silence. Instead, her reply came within an hour. Tomorrow at 10. Do not be late. Her bluntness made my hands shake. I hardly slept that night. I kept rehearsing what I might say, but every sentence crumbled before it reached my lips. What apology could I offer? What defense could possibly matter? The next morning I arrived early, my stomach tied in knots. She was already there, seated at a corner table, a cup of coffee untouched in front of her. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed, her posture rigid as though she were holding herself together by sheer will. I hesitated at the door, then forced myself to walk forward. When I sat down, she did not greet me. She did not even nod. She simply stared, her gaze heavy, making it hard to breathe. I opened my mouth, but she spoke first. Did you love him? Her question struck like a slap. I had expected anger, accusations, demands for explanations. Instead, she gave me something harder, a truth I could not run from. My throat tightened, but I answered softly. Yes, I did. For a moment, her jaw clenched, her eyes glistened, but then she blinked it away. She nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. He told me you were just a girlfriend, she said. One of many before we married. I asked once if you two ever reconnected. He laughed, told me not to worry. She gave a bitter smile that did not reach her eyes. He lied to both of us. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted her cup. I watched her, and for the first time I saw not a rival but another victim, another woman dragged into the same storm. For 25 years, she continued. I scheduled birthdays and holidays around his business trips. For 25 years, I watched my children sit by the window, waiting for him to come home, only to learn he would not return until Christmas. And now they hate me because they think I let it happen. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. They think I was not enough. I wanted to reach across the table, but I knew better. Instead, I whispered, Helena, I swear to you I did not know. Not for 1 minute. She looked at me, her eyes sharp with a question. If you had known, would you have left? The question hung between us, heavier than the air. I hesitated. I wanted to believe I would have. But 27 years is a long time to erase. Finally, I admitted, I do not know. She nodded slowly. Same. We sat in silence, two women holding the shattered pieces of the same man. Eventually, she reached into her purse and pulled out a worn envelope. She slid it across the table without explanation. Inside was a copy of his original will. In that version, everything had been left to her. She was his sole beneficiary before he changed it. I think he knew he was dying, she said. And I think somewhere in that twisted mind of his, he believed he had to choose. Maybe he thought giving everything to you would make up for the lies. Maybe it was his idea of love. I stared at the document, at the absence of my name. I had not even existed in that version of his truth. I did not ask for the money, I whispered. I still do not know what to do with it. For the first time, her eyes softened. Neither do I, she admitted. The moment stretched, fragile but real. We finished our coffee in silence. When we stood, there was no handshake, no hug, no neat closure. We simply walked away, two women bound by betrayal, each carrying wounds too deep for words. But as I stepped into the sunlight, I felt something I had not felt in weeks. Not forgiveness, not peace, but understanding. And maybe that was enough to begin. The following days were not easier, but they were different. For the first time, I was not entirely alone in my grief. Somewhere out there, Helena was carrying the same weight. That thought gave me strength. Yet the outside world was relentless. The whispers did not stop. They grew louder, sharper, until one morning I found my garage door defaced with red spray paint. One word, jagged and angry, smeared across the white surface. Liar. I stood there for a long time, staring at the word as if it had been carved onto my soul. Neighbors drove by slowly, their eyes lingering. One even offered to help me paint over it, but I declined. A part of me believed I deserved it. Another part wanted the world to see it, to see what grief twisted into rage could do. For 3 days, I left the word there. Every morning, I stared at it before leaving the house. Every night, I locked the door behind it. But on the 4th morning, something shifted. I realized I was tired of carrying shame that was not mine. I bought paint and covered the letters, watching them disappear stroke by stroke. When I finished, I caught my reflection in the window, and for the first time in weeks, I did not look away. That same day, I made a decision. If they wanted to make me a villain, then I would not play the part they assigned me. I would not react to their hatred. I would not apologize for things I had not done. I would reclaim my life, one act at a time. Quietly, I began donating. Food pantries, shelters, therapy for widows. Not for redemption, not to prove anything. Simply because giving away pieces of the poisoned inheritance felt like pulling thorns from my skin. But even that did not escape notice. Helena's daughter found out, posting online that I was trying to buy forgiveness. Guilt money, one caption sneered. My efforts twisted into another reason for condemnation. Then came the lawsuit. A formal notice delivered to my door. Helena's children were contesting the will, accusing me of manipulation, of coercing a vulnerable man, of isolating him to secure my inheritance. None of it was true, but truth no longer mattered. Perception was enough. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where William once brought me tea, holding the papers with shaking hands. The world had turned me into a criminal. The question now was not whether I could survive it, but how much more of myself I would lose before it was over. The lawsuit landed on my doorstep like a curse carved into paper. I sat staring at the envelope, the words blurring before my eyes. Emotional manipulation, coercion, exploiting a dying man. Each accusation was a dagger sharpened by grief and hatred. My lawyer assured me the case was flimsy, that the records showed William had been of sound mind when he signed the documents. But reassurance did not quiet the storm inside me. Every page of that lawsuit felt like a mirror reflecting the lies others had already painted onto me. I was not just being judged in a courtroom, I was being convicted in the court of public opinion, and that punishment was far harsher. At night I could not sleep. I paced the halls of my house with the curtains drawn, every creak of the floorboards echoing like a threat. The phone buzzed with messages I refused to open. Some were anonymous, others from people I once trusted, all carrying the same venom. Give the money back. Confess your lies. Stop hiding. I tried to tell myself these were only words, but then came the envelope taped to my front door. No stamp, no return address, only a photograph inside. It was me, standing outside the post office, my face circled in thick marker with the words, "How is the blood money, Maggie?" I dropped the photo to the floor and stumbled to the sink, my body shaking as I vomited until my stomach was empty. I was not afraid for my life. I was afraid of becoming the woman they said I was. The whispers in town grew louder. At the grocery store, people avoided my eyes. In the post office, 2 women whispered openly as I passed, their voices dripping with disdain. It no longer mattered whether their words were true or false. What mattered was that they believed them. I became a shadow in my own community, walking with my head down, feeling every gaze as a knife between my shoulders. Even the air seemed to hum with hostility. My home, once a sanctuary, had become a cage filled with ghosts and accusations. I called my lawyer again. "I want to settle," I said, my voice hoarse from nights of sleeplessness. He reminded me I did not need to. He told me the evidence was on my side, that William's will was legally airtight. But I was past the point of fighting. "I know," I whispered, "but I want to." That afternoon, I picked up the phone and called Helena. Her voice on the other end was weary but steady, as if she had been expecting my call. "I have seen what they are doing," she said. I did not know about the photo. My hands trembled as I replied, "I do not want to fight anymore. I will divide the estate." There was silence, then a single word. "Tomorrow." We met again at the same cafe where our uneasy truce had begun. She looked different this time, still tired, still grieving, but there was something softer in her expression, a loosening of the chains that bound us both. She apologized, not for her own actions, but for the cruelty of her children. The posts, the lawsuit, the harassment, they were driven by rage, she said, by the kind of grief that had nowhere to go but outward. I nodded, because I understood. Grief corrodes, it burns everything it touches, but still, it was unbearable to carry alone. For more than an hour, we spoke of things beyond money. We spoke of loss, of betrayal, of motherhood and the absence of it. She spoke of her children's anger, their conviction that she had not fought hard enough for their father's love. I spoke of the hollow quiet in my house, the way even my own reflections seemed foreign. Together we carved out a fragile honesty. Finally, we reached an agreement. A portion of the inheritance would go into a fund for her grandchildren. Another share would be directed toward a nonprofit in William's name. The rest would remain mine, not as a prize, not as an absolution, but as a burden I would choose how to carry. We signed the papers quietly, without ceremony. When we left, we walked side by side. Not as friends, not yet, but no longer as enemies either. That night, for the first time since the funeral, my house did not feel like it was collapsing around me. The walls still whispered, but their voices were softer, almost bearable. I decided to take the next step. I packed. Carefully, methodically, I dismantled the home I had once shared with William. Every creaking floorboard was a reminder of the secrets he had kept. Every drawer, every closet, seemed to hold shadows of his double life. I donated most of our furniture, giving away the pieces that no longer felt like mine. I kept only a handful of items: my mother's teacups, a few books, some clothes, and a single photograph. Everything else I left behind, not out of bitterness, but because it belonged to a life that was no longer mine. I sold the house, the so-called marital home, and bought a modest cottage 2 towns away. It had a white fence, a maple tree in the yard, and silence that did not accuse. Here, no one whispered about me in the aisles. No one looked at me with suspicion or pity. I was simply another woman moving in, starting over. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. In the mornings, I drank tea on the porch, listening to birdsong instead of the static of my own fears. I found the local library and volunteered to help. They welcomed me without questions, without judgment. One afternoon, the director handed me a box of returned books and asked if I could alphabetize them. I nearly cried at the simplicity of it, at the relief of being useful without suspicion. Soon, I began helping in the children's reading room. Their laughter filled the air. A sound so pure it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. It reminded me that not everything was tainted, that innocence still existed somewhere in the world. Loneliness lingered, but I found a companion in a golden mutt with one floppy ear, a rescue dog I named June. She followed me everywhere, her eyes filled with a loyalty I no longer knew how to trust in people. At night, she slept by my bed, her steady breathing anchoring me when memories threatened to drown me. With June at my side, the silence no longer felt hostile. It felt like healing. The settlement, the move, the small routines I built, they were not victories, but they were survival. I had lost everything I thought I knew, but in the ashes, I had begun to shape something new. Fragile though it was, I was no longer defined by what William had taken from me. I was defined by what I chose to build, even if it was only brick by brick, breath by breath. The quiet life I was beginning to build did not last untouched. For a time, my days in the new town passed gently, almost invisibly. I walked June through tree-lined streets, waved at neighbors who knew me only as the woman with the floppy-eared dog, and breathed without the constant weight of accusation. But peace is fragile, and sometimes grief refuses to stay buried. It claws its way back through the cracks, dragging with it the voices of those who refuse to let go. It began with an envelope left on my doorstep, eerily similar to the one that had carried that cruel photograph months earlier. Plain, no return address, nothing to identify who had placed it there. My heart sank as I bent down to pick it up. Inside were photocopy-sold legal filings, fragments of emails, and scrawled across the top in thick red marker, "You thought we were done?" My hands shook as I read. I did not need a signature. I knew it was Helena's son. He had refused to accept the settlement, refused the fragile peace his mother and I had managed to piece together. I had heard whispers that he felt betrayed by her for agreeing to divide the estate. Now his obsession had grown into a new crusade. He was reaching out to William's colleagues, digging through archives, clinging to the belief that I had manipulated a dying man into giving me everything. That envelope was his warning. The war was not over. I called my lawyer immediately. He told me there was nothing new in the papers, nothing actionable, only noise. But noise can still shatter the fragile glass of healing. Within days, local whispers returned, fueled by vague reports of new accusations. The news barely mentioned my name, just enough to rekindle speculation. I stayed indoors for a week, curtains drawn, the old paranoia creeping back into my chest. Every time June barked at the sound of footsteps outside, my heart raced. It felt like I was back at the beginning, suffocated by suspicion and fear. Then came the phone call I did not expect. Helena's voice on the other end was steady, but beneath it I heard exhaustion. "I know what he is doing," she said. "I am sorry." I stayed silent, unsure what to say. She continued, "He is angry, but he is not well. He is trying to punish someone because he does not know what to do with his grief. I will not let him use William's ghost to destroy you or me." 2 days later, she arrived at my cottage in person. She carried no bitterness, only determination. She had filed a statement with the Attorney General, publicly declaring that I had not coerced William, that his will had been his choice, not mine. She stood beside me in court as the judge reviewed the attempt to reopen the case. It lasted less than 30 minutes. The evidence was unchanged, the accusations hollow, case dismissed. Just like that, the storm that had loomed over me for weeks evaporated into nothing. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions. I kept my head down, unwilling to feed their hunger. But Helena stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "She is not the villain," she said. "She is another victim of the same man who deceived us all. My son needs help, not more pain. And Margaret deserves peace." For the first time in what felt like forever, someone defended me publicly, fiercely, without hesitation. I cried later, not out of relief, but because I finally felt seen. From that moment, our bond shifted. We no longer met as enemies circling each other, but as women who had survived the same storm. We sat together in parks, watching her grandchildren play, sometimes talking, sometimes simply breathing in silence. I realized then that healing is not about erasing the past. It is about learning to live alongside it without letting it poison every breath. Life in my small cottage began to grow roots. I joined a community gardening group, signed up for cooking classes at the senior center, and continued my work at the library. People there did not whisper about betrayal or money. They knew me as Miss Maggie, the woman who read children's stories with too many voices, who brought homemade cookies to share, who carried dog treats in her coat pocket. The scandal that had once defined me became a shadow that grew fainter with each passing season. Helena visited often, sometimes with her grandchildren. They were shy at first, wary of me. But June worked her quiet magic, coaxing them into laughter. Slowly, they began calling me Miss Maggie too, a title that pierced my heart with something I had never known. Belonging. I never tried to replace anyone, never tried to be more than I was. I simply showed up, present and steady. In time, that was enough. The holidays brought a moment I never could have imagined a year earlier. An invitation arrived in the mail. Helena's handwriting neat and deliberate. "Christmas Eve dinner, bring June. No pressure, but we would love to have you." I sat staring at the card for hours, unsure whether to cry or smile. A year ago, I had been painted as the thief who stole her husband's legacy. Now, she was asking me to sit at her family's table. That night was fragile, filled with small gestures that meant more than words. Her daughter offered me a cautious smile. Her grandchildren tugged at my hand to show me their toys. Helena hugged me at the door with an embrace that was not stiff or forced, but real. For the first time since William's funeral, I felt the stirrings of something like family. Not perfect, not whole, but chosen in the ashes of betrayal. I still received letters now and then, whispers of the past trying to claw their way back. Articles resurfaced, old acquaintances reached out with thinly veiled curiosity, but I no longer gave them space. They belonged to another life, one I had buried with reverence. I had survived the fire, and now I was living in the quiet after the storm. Some days, I still thought about him, not the lies, but the fragments of love that had felt real. I thought about the way he laughed at old movies, the way he clipped coupons, the way he told me I was enough. I knew those memories were tangled in deceit, but I refused to let them rot me from the inside. Instead, I held them lightly, reminders of both what I had lost and what I had survived. One spring evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the air smelled faintly of lilacs, I realized something profound. Betrayal had nearly destroyed me, but it had also stripped me down to my core, forcing me to rebuild not as William's wife, not as someone's mistress, not as a villain in a story I never wrote. I was simply me, stronger, wiser, alive. I had not just survived. I had claimed peace on my own terms, not through revenge, not through wealth, but through resilience, through grace, through the choice to live fully when every lie begged me to crumble. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, and for the first time I was ready. When I look back now, I see two funerals. The first was the day I buried William, laying to rest the man I thought I knew. The second was quieter, invisible to the world, the day I buried the woman I once was. That woman trusted too easily, loved without question, built her life on the fragile foundation of someone else's secrets. She died with him, but what rose from her ashes was not the same person. It was someone scarred, yes, but also stronger, clearer, and no longer willing to carry shame that did not belong to her. There are still nights when the silence presses in, and I feel the sting of betrayal as if it were fresh. Grief does not vanish. It lingers. It echoes. But grief is also a teacher. It taught me that survival is not just about breathing. It is about choosing who you will become when the world tries to define you as something less. For months, I was painted as a villain, a thief, a mistress who stole a life that was never hers. But I know the truth. I was a wife deceived, a woman discarded, a soul left to navigate the wreckage of a man's double life. And in choosing to keep walking, I found something no inheritance could ever buy: dignity. I think often of Helena, of the strange bond we built from the rubble of his lies. We were supposed to be enemies, but we became mirrors instead. We saw in each other the same wounds, the same resilience. In her eyes, I recognized my own strength. From her voice, I borrowed courage. Together, we learned that betrayal does not have to leave us broken. It can carve out space for new beginnings, even if those beginnings are imperfect. Life will never look the way I once imagined it would. There will be no porch shared with William in old age, no laughter of children with his eyes. But there is something else, something I never expected. A small cottage filled with light, a dog who loves me without conditions, a library where children call me Miss Maggie, and a family not bound by blood but chosen through compassion and survival. These are not replacements for what was lost. They are the proof that even after devastation, life can still bloom. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this: you are not defined by the lies others tell, nor by the pain they leave behind. You are defined by what you choose to do with the broken pieces. You can let them bury you, or you can use them to build something stronger. I chose to build. And if I can rise from the ruins of betrayal, so can you. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, if you saw even a piece of your own reflection in my pain or my healing, I ask you to stay with me. Subscribe to Silent Lies so together we can uncover more stories, more truths hidden in the shadows, and remind ourselves that even in the darkest deception we are never truly alone.